allowed to.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Calgary-Midnapore.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure for me to be here today and to contribute to this debate on C-11. I'll start by saying, Mr. Speaker, I've kind of reached the point in my political career. I've been here 4 years now, hard to believe. I just had my 4-year anniversary on April 3rd that I've been serving the good people of Calgary-Midnapore, which I'm so fortunate to do. And I've kind of arrived at the place, Mr. Speaker, where if I really don't believe that the messenger themselves are sincere, I have a really hard time believing the message. It's really hard for me to think about the policy, understand the policy, if I don't have a lot of good faith in the individual or entity from which it is coming from. And I think there stems one of the two struggles that I have with this bill, Mr. Speaker. The first one being I don't genuinely believe in the sincerity of this government to protect Canadians. And I've seen this from many perspectives, both past and present, and I'll get that into that a little bit more in my speaking. And my second concern, which again falls into sort of a generalization, but still remains for me, is that I see this government doing things in a half-hearted effort. And I believe this kind of is along the same line of my first point of the insincerity. When I refer to my past experience with this, Mr. Speaker, what I'm really drawing upon is my time as the shadow minister for democratic institutions. And C-11 is relevant to that time for a couple of reasons here. The first being that during my time as shadow minister for democratic institutions, this is when the digital charter was announced. And this was a piece of, if not legislation, certainly an important policy announcement, which was supposed to carry a lot of weight with it. This was at the time that we were debating Bill C-76, which would have major implications on future elections. And the digital conversation, along with foreign interference and foreign influence, had a lot to contribute to that discussion around Bill C-76 at this time. So when the current Minister of Industry did his announcement at that time, along with the current Minister of Democratic Institutions, it felt very flat. It felt as though it was very frankly one of those commercials you would see for children on Saturday morning, or I guess since the current government likes to insult conservative institutions so much, perhaps a video you would see from PragerU, but it really didn't come across to me with a lot of sincerity and a lot of teeth. It just sort of seemed to do what this government likes to do, which is a lot of virtue signaling. As well, the second element from democratic institutions that this bill reminds me of is the tribunal composition. And it always makes me a little concerned whenever the government goes to create a body which has any type of implications as to the directions of the lives or industry of Canadians. And I'm thinking of the Debates Commission at that time, which I believe significantly impacted the debates framework in the last election. And if we look back now, interestingly enough, I recall the question from the Member of Parliament for Provencher to the previous speaker, who was on this Debates Commission, Mr. Speaker? Well, it was in fact one of the Kielburger brothers. So it's very interesting that we find this here today. And as we have seen, Mr. Speaker, this is one thing, even within the framework of the C-11 legislation, is that I'm concerned about, and that is that this government always finds a way to take care of their friends. And we've seen this, Mr. Speaker, be it with SNC, the implications of that, which we are still dealing with here today as we go through the pandemic, with Mr. Bayless, of course, the former member of parliament here, and of course which has been alluded to before, the We Charity scandal, where the previous speaker indicated, unfortunately, this is being sent to ethics rather than industry in an effort to delay that. So even in the context of C-11 and what this is supposed to do, I do worry about the government taking care of their friends. Now, I mentioned how the second part of my concern is that this government does everything half-heartedly. And I believe that this legislation includes that without question. We look at the possibility of information being shared with other parties. This act still does allow an organization to transfer an individual's personal information to a service provider without their knowledge or consent. Regarding the right to have the collecting party delete collected information on request. It somewhat deals with that, but I know certainly myself when I've even tried to unsubscribe in some situations, it's definitely been unsuccessful. We also see this, Mr. Speaker, in this bill with the right to opt out of the sale of personal information, where in fact an organization may transfer an individual's personal information to a service provider, again, without their consent or knowledge. So this is a theme, Mr. Speaker, that I'm seeing in terms of the government addressing things half-heartedly, and C-11 definitely falls within this. But then also, Mr. Speaker, I think we have seen this half-hearted response with the pandemic from the very beginning in terms of the government eliminating the warning system just prior to the pandemic's arrival, to the return of personal protective equipment, which showed such a lack of foresight for the necessity of its use. Not months later, the slow closing of borders, which we saw at the very beginning, which in my position as Shadow Minister for Transport, I've seen incredible draconian measures which were inserted as a result of a poor response earlier on. And this is the same with just about any situation in life, Mr. Speaker. The longer you allow something to fester, the greater response it requires later on. And unfortunately, Canadians are paying the price for the inaction. Rapid testing, and of course, vaccines, which is a complete failure of this government and of the Prime Minister. And I want to say to any Canadian out there who is listening to this speech, if you are upset because your business is closed, if you are upset because your children are at home and are not at school, if you are upset because you haven't seen your family in 6 months, 1 year, 18 months, if you're upset because there is a third wave, it is the fault of the Prime Minister for so poorly preparing for the later stages of this pandemic. And this is another half-hearted response, which I have referred to, Mr. Speaker. We've also seen this, unfortunately, within Defense Committee, Mr. Speaker, whereby this government was willing to turn their backs on women all across the country in not believing the stories. And yet they're willing to investigate the unfortunate situation of the member for Pontiac, who is an incredible individual, might I say. My husband and I had the good fortune of traveling to Israel with him. And I will stand in solidarity with him. In kindergarten, I was painting a picture, and when I was done, I had taken off my smock and was standing there in my slip when my good friend, Kim Crocker, who I later had the pleasure of serving in Students' Council with in high school at Beaverbrook, said to me, "You're standing there in your slip," as all the fine women of Calgary, Midnapore did wear at that time. But my point being, they have turned their backs on women in defense, in the Defense Committee as well. But, Mr. Speaker, if there is something good to be said about this piece of legislation, I will say again, in my capacity as Shadow Minister for Transport, I have had many right to repair organizations which have come to me, the second repair shops, the small little repair shops across rural Canada, in the suburbs of Canada, who have said that Canadians have the right to own their data. And I know colleagues, even within the Conservative Party, will argue if this is a property right and a human right. And as we advance in the digital age, Mr. Speaker, I believe more and more that this is a human right, that our history of data will one day be almost synonymous with our DNA. So I will leave it there, Mr. Speaker. Again, I feel as though this government, I don't believe in their sincerity of protecting Canadians. I believe that so much that they do is a half-hearted effort. And for both of these reasons, I stand here today in regards to C-11 with certainly a lot of questions about the legislation, but the belief that I am not certain if this legislation goes far enough. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Before we get to questions and comments, I see the honourable member for Cloverdale Langley City is indicating a point of order. The honourable member.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm rising today in response to the point of order made by the member for Don Valley West. As I said to the member on Friday, the Bible verse I quoted was in reference to hypocrisy, which has been a common interpretation of that passage, as the member for Don Valley West himself acknowledges this morning. Last week, I called to apologize to the member for the misunderstanding, and I'd like to extend that apology to all members of the House and anyone in the LGBTQ community who took offense. The quote I used was certainly not intended in the way it's being portrayed, and I'm glad to have the chance to clarify. I unreservedly apologize. Thank you.
I thank the honourable member for Cloverdale Langley City for her additional comments on the matter. We'll now go to questions and comments, and I see the honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When the member started her speech, she pretty much started it with the same way that she ended it, which was she said, and I quote, "I don't believe the government's sincerity to protect Canadians." I just find that quote so incredibly troubling, Mr. Speaker. I think it's one thing to come into this House and to debate policy and to challenge each other to make better laws and better policies, but to suggest that somebody lacks sincerity to do good is just taking it to a whole new level. If she doesn't think that the government is sincere in its desire to protect Canadians, well, could she then share with us what she thinks the government is trying to do, apparently maliciously, to Canadians? I think what she means is she's not happy with the legislation, but I don't think she means that the government and this side of the House lacks the sincerity to try. Could she clarify that?
For Calgary Midnapore.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you very much to the member for Kingston and the Islands, who we're also familiar with at this point. And he's right. I do question the sincerity, I guess, but more important for Canadians as we head into this spring and this summer, since the end of the session and into the summer. I question their competence, and I think that's even just as important, if not more so. Right? There is always the two questions: are they evil or are they incompetent? Evil's a strong word, so I certainly won't touch upon that. But incompetence for certain, over and over again here. So, to the member of Kingston, the Islands, yeah, he is correct. It is. I would actually say it is perhaps more incompetence than insincerity. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for La Pointe de l'Île. Yes, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to hear what the member could say about 2 points. First, this bill admits an important element in terms of protecting online ID, in terms of identity theft of individuals, and also the fact that the government is not cleaning up its own house because the bill does not concern the federal government, even though online identity theft is clearly deficient. The honourable member for Calgary, Midnapore.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for his question. Yes, I did say with the digital charter and also with C-11, this is not the only thing we've seen. It's not enough. It doesn't go far enough. And I think all bills, this is the case, but there is some latitude. And with most of my speeches, I've been many examples where we can see that it doesn't go far enough. And in my opinion, it started 2-3 years ago with the digital charter, but I think we can see it with C-11 as well. It's a good start, but we're not doing enough. Thank you. We do have time for one quick question. The honourable member for Winnipeg Centre.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for her intervention. I agree with her. I think we absolutely need to protect people's data. My concern, certainly I have the same sort of concerns with this current government. I had the same concerns as well with the Conservative government as well, because they also failed to act, and now people's private information is getting out in droves now. I was wondering if she could respond to that. Thank you.
Honourable member for Calgary-Midnapore.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague from Winnipeg Centre for the question. I had the pleasure of serving on HUMA with her, and I certainly hope that she's doing well. Unfortunately, we've never had a federal New Democratic Party government, and so I wouldn't be able to comment on their performance had it ever occurred in Canadian history. Thank you.